Okay, so this is gonna be really fucking difficult for me to actually talk about because I am so goddamn bad at explaining my thoughts in a chart. But yeah, today I'm gonna go through, as you can see from the title, Over the Flood. Over the Flood is a chart that I made like 2 days ago, and I was pretty happy with it. And even though I took a fairly simple approach, give me a moment. See if anyone's at the door. Alright, it was just my imagination. That tends to happen. I have schizophrenia now. Anyway, yeah, my approach to Over the Flood is fairly light, fairly modular, I'd say. And what I mean by modular is that I have a lot of rules in mind, or actually not that many rules. I'd say like I only put in like 3 or 4 different rules, and I apply all of them throughout the chart whenever possible. And that kind of means that I don't really have to rely on intuition, which is something that many charters do in their charts, like IC, Evening. I'd say most new charters rely more on intuition rather than rules, I'd say. So basically, Over the Flood is a very systematic, the charting approach to Over the Flood is very, very systematic, but it works out pretty well, so that's nice, I guess. So what did I chart Over the Flood? I didn't like IC's chart at all. I felt that the chart is super, super heavy, like way too heavy for my taste. And even though I have another difficulty that I made in 2016, it's just a very slight modification of IC's chart because I already made Looming Shadow, I already made Nature of Dying. Well, not made. I wanted to make a Semantic Compositions chart. And IC had both a Nature of Dying chart and an Over the Flood chart. So okay, I thought like, okay, let's just make a chart. Let's just make the medley or whatever, a marathon. And that was. I just made slight modifications to it because I didn't think his chart was good enough at the time. The chart still isn't good, and that's the main reason why I haven't released it to Stepmania. So this is like my redemption attempt, I guess, of making a better chart for Over the Flood. So, yeah, 2.5 minutes in, you guys haven't seen the chart at all, so yeah, just go into the chart. Okay, the rest of that is just a repeat. So let's go through this section real quick. This is just a typical layering, as you can expect. Maybe, now let's just talk about the location of the bass kick. The note that corresponds to the bass kick is usually on the first column, the third column, or the second column. And every snare will always be a 1, 2, or 3, 4, and this is a pretty prevalent rule. Or at least every snare of this type will be a 1, 2, or 3, 4. The main thing I want to say is that the primary snare will always have a 1, 2, or 3, 4 chord corresponding to it all the time. And this never changes in the chart. There are some exceptions to the rule, like in the bass kick section, the very heavy bass kick section, but other than that, like the rule is pretty much the same thing. Like the most regular chord will always be 1, 2, or 3, 4. So this is your standard layering. There's a bass kick here. Like in hindsight, I probably should have placed it here, but the difference is pretty minor, and I don't know really. Maybe I could place it. Maybe I could place it here, but I really don't know. Like the thing is, there's also an additional rule that I had in mind, and the rule is basically the fact that if there are 2 or more bass kicks consecutively, they create some sort of 2-handed motion. As you can see, this requires your right hand and this requires your left hand. So it doesn't really matter if it's on the first column or the second column. It creates a 1-hand two-hand thrilling motion either way. Whereas this is from a hi-hat. Like this note goes to a hi-hat. And basically, if there's a hi-hat, then it creates a 1-hand throw or a gallop or a roll. So that's what I did. This creates a rolly pattern, a one-hand gallopy pattern, if you wish to call it that. This note doesn't create a one-hand twirly pattern, but at the same time, it's also like the easiest configuration anyway. Because if I place it here, for example, it's pretty difficult relative to this, and I don't really want unnecessary difficulty because hi-hats are pretty insignificant, so I just use the next easiest configuration, and this is the easiest configuration. Because if I place it here, then it creates some sort of stress on the left middle finger. But it's not very significant anyway, so it doesn't really matter too much. This is just PR. Bass kick, snare, piano. As you can see, this rule just repeats over and over because the section is pretty much the same thing over and over anyway, so I'm just going to keep using that rule. These are rolls. You could use 16s here. I could have used 16s here, but I didn't think that the sound was shrill enough or sharp enough to be 16s, so I used rolls here. You can argue that this is a bit underwhelming, but I think this is the best solution. Transition. Alright, now you might be wondering like, okay, why there's so many 1/4 chords all of a sudden? Didn't you make a rule that only allocates certain snares to 3/4 or 1/2? This is a different snare altogether. Sorry, this snare is a different snare altogether. But the problem is I might have overlooked a couple of snares because my ears are kind of wonky. But basically, these kinds of snares will only correspond to 1/4, the chord 1/4. But there are exceptions to the rule, of course, like if this one chord sounds really similar to one in the first section, if a snare sounds really similar to the snare that you heard in the first section, then it will obviously be 1/2 or 3/4 because that is just what's the word that I'm looking for? Just an application of the rule that is applied before. So, and the bass kick rule is still there. Like this is a bass kick, and since these are 2 bass kicks, and they're on 8 intervals, then I just make jacks. But if they're 16s, I would have just made a 2-hand drilling motion, like this, for example. That's something that I forgot to mention because I'm retarded, but now you know. Let's slow down the song a little bit, actually. Now this is actually 32nd or 24ths, but I only use 16ths here because it's a very, very soft sound, and I felt that using 24ths here would have been too overwhelming. So I just used something simpler, and I used 16ths with rolly patterning, as you can see here. This creates a rolly pattern, and no matter what, you always create some sort of 2-handed gallop. So I just use this to differentiate between, to slightly differentiate between 16ths, form like this, because they're a little bit different sounds. So I want to differentiate like the characteristics of the certain pattern, or the triplet, if you wish to call it that. Like these might be 3/4 or 1/2 actually. I could be wrong, but you can get the idea. That might be a repeat. It's actually just a repeat anyway. It doesn't really matter too much. This is just 3 consecutive bass kicks. So I create a 3-note 2-handed mini throw. So again, this is a fairly simple structure, very modular, as I said. Basically, bass kicks go to a certain pattern, and then there are some notes that should have been 24s. I changed them to 16s because I didn't think that they were heavy enough. There is additional thing that I might have overlooked, so let me go through it again. Yeah, as you can see, like there might be some sounds that are 16s, like this. I didn't want to use 16s because I already used 16s beforehand. So the step down will be to use 8s, and that's what I did there. I tried to use, I don't think I've actually tried to use anything here, actually. Ignore me, but... Oh, wait, because this creates a one-hand gallop, I wanted it to make it different, so I use a two-hand gallop or something. It's a fairly situational rule that doesn't really apply all that often, so it's not really that significant, but it's something that I try to follow. Basically, if one certain sound creates some sort of motion, then another sound or a different sound shouldn't create the same motion. And that's pretty much what I did here. One-hand gallop, then two-hand gallop. Alright, we went through this. This section is mostly bass kicks. So I use primarily thrilly motions. As you can see, a lot of these create one-hand thrilly motions, two-hand thrilly motions. As you can see, this creates two-hand, 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 two-hand. This is like the only exception because placing this on 4 would have been a bit too abrasive overall. So I just used something simpler there. But for the most part, I used standard thrilly motion for this section. Some people might have used 16s here. I didn't because I thought that it would have been too heavy. Because like the main thing you hear are the bass kicks. So, and the bass kicks are on 8s. So I place 8s there. And since there's just 4 basics consecutively on 8s, I just used 2 mini jacks. I could have used 4-note jack, but that would have been too rude. So I just used 2 mini jacks, and that worked out perfectly fine. Okay, this might be a bit controversial, I guess. Well, it's not super controversial in the grand scheme of things, but I used 1, 4, and 2, 3 here. I didn't really have a strong reason to do it. I just wanted to do it just to like maximize rhythmic variations to some degree. You can very certainly use 3, 4, 1, 2 here, and there wouldn't be any problem whatsoever, but I don't know, I just didn't feel like using it. I could experiment a little bit and use something like this. Actually, I like this way more. I'm gonna keep this. Yeah, my capriciousness my caprice kinda got to me there. Yeah, I like this way more. I actually did a couple of changes overall to the chart that I have to update to Osamania, so I have to do that later. Okay, so this snare is pretty different from the rest of the snares that we've heard. So I use a different chord here, which is kind of standard instrumental relevance exposed there. Same thing, different snare, so I just use this. This is the same snare as this, and this is practically the same chord. This is just mirrored. Like 1, 3, 2, 4. If you flip 1, 3, you get 2, 4. Okay, this one is a bit of an exception as well. Like I could most definitely use 3, 4, 3, 4, but I didn't want to because I didn't really like creating. I didn't really like creating like a 5-note drill or 3-note anchor essentially for these kinds of sounds, because I felt that bass kicks and snares are a bit too disconnected overall. So like snares and bass kicks sound a bit too disconnected, so I didn't want to create like a 5-note, a 3-note jack here. I do use 3-note jacks. It's just that I don't use it for these kinds of sounds or these kinds of combinations of bass kicks and snares. So basically I had a little rule that like if there is 2 snares with an eighth note gap, they have to be different snares. They have to use different chords. So this has to be 3-4-1-2, and this has to be something else. In this case, I used 2-4 because it's the only one that I could have used. I could use like 1-4 or something like that, but that would be kind of gross because I have to shift everything else. But yeah, that's a viable option if I wanted to. And obviously I have to adhere to this all the time, so whatever. Oh yeah, there must be 16ths as well, I believe, so. It's a very specific rule, but I think it works out perfectly fine. And it kind of reduces the strain of this pattern that could have been unnecessary, so that's always a plus. Alright, I gotta change this as well because I'm an idiot. Oh yeah, I had to use rolling motion here because it would have been too straining otherwise. Maybe I should, what if I do this? Because this has to create a 2-hand rolling motion, because these are 2 bass kicks. Ooh. I have to mirror the entire thing actually, oh god. I don't know actually. Actually, I think that would work. I'll just flip everything real quick. Yeah, you're also watching me chart as I do this, which is kind of silly, but you know, there are some things that I make mistakes, obviously. I'm superhuman. Well, I'm really human, so. Oh, the mine. I forgot about this mine. The mine is just to capture like the very faint 16th, because the 16th is just a bit too light overall. This is just a transition for me. .24 is for the lighter hissing sound, lighter hi-hats. This is for the more shrill hi-hats. All right, now we're finally entering the heart of the song, which is basically the super breakcore sections that I brought up, or the 8-band break sections in general. Hold up. Yeah, as you can see, I might have made a couple of mistakes here and there, because this is actually a fairly rough draft, but the main idea of what I'm doing is pretty much the same, so. The same snare rule is applied. Like a lot of snares here are 1, 2, 1, 2, or 3, 4. Bass kick, hi-hats, bass kick. I had to use 3/4 here because it leads it to two consecutive snares. So no matter what, even though there's a bass kick here, I have to use a 3/4 pattern here just to reduce pattern difficulty. Bass kick. It's not really a hi-hat, but since there's already like a two-hand drilling motion here, I have to use a one-hand drilling motion here. Bass kick, hi-hat, 5 bass kicks. This is a forced position because this is a different snare from the rest of the snares, and I cannot, and this is like the easiest configuration of this pattern. Like if I use a one-hand drilling pattern, I'll create a one-hand drill. So for occasions like this, I'll just use two-hand drilling patterns because it's like the simplest pattern overall, and the pattern with the less strain. Same rule of this. I'll create a one-hand drill if I use two-hand drilling motion here. This is something that I might change because it most certainly isn't loud. Most certainly isn't like a bass kick, so I don't think I should be using one-hand drilling patterning here. But there's a one-hand drill gallop here, so I really don't know what I'm gonna do here. And this snare is kind of forced because it's for the same reason as because it's a fairly faint snare, and it's definitely not the same snares as like this or that. I didn't think the snare here was loud enough, but I can most certainly add a snare here if I wanted to, or double. But I didn't think it was loud enough, but that's something that I could definitely change. This is something that I have to like change throughout the chart, so apologies if you see me editing the chart every now and again. Also, since there's a snare here regardless, I just use a mini jack here, which is pretty much standard layering really. Patterning, sorry. 4 bass kicks, fairly faint snare here. Hi-hats, 2 bass kicks, different snare again. This is a snare that I felt was a bit too soft as well, which is why I used a single here. But it creates a mini jack regardless, so it follows the same rule as before. I could most definitely use something like this. But I don't know, I think it felt a little bit too homogeneous compared to this. So that was why I didn't use that pattern. But it wouldn't have changed much either way, so I don't know, maybe I could keep that. That's something I have to like experiment with. Maybe this is the pattern that's wrong, I don't know. Again, this is like the same hi-hat, bass kick rule, and snare rule as you already knew from before. Same thing. Hi-hat, bass kick, creates a two-hand throw, different snare, Same as this. And it repeats. Oh. Okay, that's just echo. This is actually a note that I'm not sure if I should add. Because if you slow it down quite a bit, you can definitely hear a hi-hat, but it's certainly pretty soft, so I might remove that note actually. Bass kick shit, as you might know. And basically, this amen break section repeats throughout the entire chart actually, so you might not see much variance throughout the chart. But, and since the rules are so, they're fairly strict, like they limit the amount of patterns that you can create. And as a result, the chart might seem a bit mundane overall, especially when this same section repeats over and over. The main difference between this section, for example, and, hold on, let me just double check if one section is correct, because it's something that I just edited in. That actually might be a section that I overlooked. Let me just go through it real quick again. I apologize for the slight delay, but as you can see, I'm not very good at preparing my own shit. It's kind of weird, like, why is that the only occasion where I can hear very distinct bass kicks? Yeah, it's really weird, but that's kind of a weird idiosyncrasy that Gorshik kind of does. I don't know why he does it though. Anyway. Yeah, next section. Basically the same section as before, but with piano. So pay attention to what's going on here. Miss it? Let's do it again. Basically, piano, like certain piano notes, like the ones that are pretty loud or prominent, will have an offset 16th. The 16th will be offset by a 1/92 to differentiate between regular 16ths. It's a fairly normal accentuation, essentially, and it's something that people can do to accentuate certain notes without actually increasing the density of that particular moment of the chart. And it's most certainly something that I recommend people to do, because you know, you can only capture so much with just density alone. That might be something I might change actually, because this is actually a hi-hat, but we'll see. Different snare, yada yada yada. This is actually kind of iffy. I'm not too sure if I want to use 1/4 or at least, yeah, something like 1/4 here, because I used a different chord here because I wanted to emphasize the piano, but I don't think it would have been a good idea to use a different snare overall. So that's something that I might change in the future. Bass kick. Bass kick. This should be one. This should be I don't think it could have been anything actually. This creates a one-hand throw. So like, yeah, this creates a one-hand throw, so this cannot be a one-hand throw anymore because otherwise it would have been too difficult. So I have to use a two-hand throwing motion here, then two-hand throw motion here. Oh, this section is basically just a progression of the section before it. Basically, this is your standard layering as usual from the past two sections, and it's pretty much recycled throughout with a couple of slight pattern variations to obviously not seem like it's copy-pasted, but the structure of the chart is pretty much the same thing over and over for this section. The only difference between this section, the section before, and the section before it is the main melody of the song, and how I emphasize that main melody. So in this section, I emphasize the three notes as you saw. I emphasize certain chords like before, but I use a different way of emphasizing them. So since they're louder chords, I thought that it would be a good idea to use doubles here. And I didn't use doubles for all of them, like I only used it for these two chords because this chord is fairly soft, so I thought that, you know, it shouldn't be that bad. And then I also wanted to, but I still wanted to differentiate between, the piano emphasis that I used before, so I used a couple of mini holes here. I believe the mini holes are of like 24th length. Either 24th or 32nd, I don't really recall. Okay, it's 24th. But yeah, it is just a typical emphasis. You might argue that like the additional layering of the mini hole and the double might be excessive, and I might be compelled to agree, but that's certainly one way you can do to emphasize certain sections of the song. And if you emphasize it before, and if you feel that this emphasis should be more significant, then you could definitely use holes or something similar to that, because color emphasis you can only add color emphasis in one way, which is to offset them or use different colors. But other than that, you can't really differentiate between a really heavy color emphasis and a fairly light color emphasis, if that even exists. It doesn't exist. So mini holes or mini long notes, if you wish to call it that, in Osomania is one way you can do it. This is a fairly light chord, as I mentioned. These two are pretty heavy, so these are doubles, even though this is already a double anyway, so it doesn't really matter too much. Yeah, this is a fourth position because there's two bass kicks here, and there's a hi-hat there, so this has to be a mini throw, unfortunately. Actually, let me double check that one chord above. Yeah, it's a different chord. Different snare, I bet. People have actually told me that the even though the accentuation by offsetting certain notes is pretty minor, they did feel the difference, and that's a really, really good thing, because especially when you're playing on a note skin which shows snap colors, like this note skin, for example, like the 190 seconds will stand out. And that's kind of a problem with Osomania for me, because like if you remove the way of like emphasizing certain notes by offsetting them, you're taking away one form of emphasis. Similar to how mini holes are slowly being more and more obsolete, because certain note skins like Divide by Zero, for example, don't really show the mini holes at all, because they didn't think, because mini holes are a distraction for most players, really. And they don't really add anything to the gameplay aspect of it. Like, it's just emphasis. But like, if you're playing on a note skin that shows long notes, that shows like really short holes and shows offset notes, then you can most certainly tell the difference, and that was the goal that I was going for. But in Osomania, it might be a bit more difficult because the offset note might not be that significant. Like, they might be able to see the offset note just a weeny tiny bit, but it's not going to be that significant for some people. Like, the main thing that they will be able to see are the mini holes, as you can see here. Okay, this section is basically, well, this section is just the same aim and break section, I feel, but with less snares, I think. And I just follow the same principles here. Basically, if there's two bass kicks, or if there's a bass kick, I create a two-hand drilling motion. If there are hi-hats, I just use, if there are two hi-hats consecutively, I use a rolling motion. For example, three hi-hats, so one-hand drilling motion. Again, since I already used a one-hand drilling motion here, I can't use a one-hand drilling motion again, so this has to be a two-hand drilling motion. Two-hand drilling motion because of two-hand drilling motion because of a bass kick, but I wouldn't have actually had a choice either way, so this is kind of a moot point. Exception to the rule again, because there's a different snare from the others, so this has to be a 2-3. Bass kick, two-hand throw. This is actually pretty cute. I didn't actually realize I did this. These are all bass kicks, and it's kind of P-art, which is kind of cute, but I didn't intend to do that. But basically, this creates some sort of, this forces a one-hand throw, this forces a two-hand throw as well. But again, this wouldn't have changed either way. 4-note consecutive bass kicks, so two-hand drilling motion here. The piano thing, as I mentioned earlier. This is pretty silly, but basically what I did here is that since the note isn't really emphasized, like the piano isn't really capturing this note, but it's still touching on the note. Like, there is some piano in this section and this section, so I just split in two. And basically, the more prominent piano sound will have the mini hole here. Two-hand throw. Two-hand throw. Two-hand throw. 24ths to the distorted piano. Bass kicks. Bass kick. Snare. Some people might have used 30 seconds here. Again, I thought it was too soft, so I didn't use any 24ths or anything of that sort. Same principles as before. I don't have to mention it again. This is to like the distorted piano. Like, you can definitely hear like this weird repeated note, this repeated consecutive note. Like, I should have used like a 3-note throw here, but I wanted to transition to the bass kicks, so I used something like this. And it reduces the amount of strain without actually hurting too much musical relevance, without hurting the emphasis on the repeated note, because this is like the only time where you're gonna see a 16 mini jack in the chart. So the emphasis isn't really lost all that much. Alright, this section, it follows similar logic as I mentioned before. Basically, softer snares will have a different snare from 1, 2, or 3, 4, or if the snare is different, they have a different snare. Basically, if the snare is different from the main snare, it's not a 1, 2, or 3, 4. There are some exceptions to the rule, but that's the main rule. Now, this section is pretty different because the snares are used in a fairly different way from the rest of the chart. But the chart isn't that much harder in this section for some reason. Well, not for some reason, but it's just not much harder overall. So, okay, I'm just gonna show you what I mean. Okay, bass kick here. 2 bass kicks. Different snare. I could have used, I very definitely could have used a 3, 4 here, but can I? 1, 2? I can only use 1, 2 here, and I didn't want to use the same snare, I think. No strong reason for it, but I could have definitely done it. I think this is just for rhythmic variation. Bass kick. Bass kick. Snare. Light snare. Heavy snare. Or main snare. Another snare, a lighter snare, and that really should have been, that technically should have been any chord but this chord actually. Any chord but this chord or this chord, but since I already used a double before, if I used any other chord, I would have created anchor, like a pretty long anchor either way, like a 3-note anchor on the same hand. So I thought, like, you know, that isn't really necessary because this is a fairly light snare, so there's really no point in actually creating any more mini jacks, so I just used the easiest configuration, which is 1, 2, as I mentioned before. Oh yeah, the piano emphasis, as I forgot to, I overlooked, because it's so minor, but it's pretty minor, but you can definitely see it. Um, 30 seconds, because like 30 seconds are there. Bass kicks. Bass kick. Hi-hat. Bass kick, hi-hat. This should technically, oh no, I don't think I could have chosen any chord either way. Yeah, actually I probably should change the, there's one chord. I probably should have changed this chord. Maybe, yeah, let me just change it real quick because, you know, it's pretty minor. Yeah, actually this was perfect. Oh yeah, I actually forgot to talk about this chord. Like, why is this chord different from the one above? And the main reason is because I wanted to differentiate between the layering from I want to differentiate the layering in this section pretty subtly. So, and this is kind of a rule that I actually applied beforehand. Basically, if there's like a 16th in between 2 snares, this chord must be different. So I pretty much just followed that rule from the very beginning. Hold on, let me just remember this one. 246. There is one part of the song in the intro that follows that specific rule, but I can't find it with me right now. Let me check real quick. As you can see, I didn't prepare my... Okay, this particular 2 snares, same sound. There's a 16 in between it, so this must be a different chord. So I used 2, 4 here, and I pretty much did that. I pretty much did this specific rule throughout the snare section, which I brought up. Wait, where was it? 245? Yeah. Bass kick, bass kick. I probably should have used a snare. I probably should have used a double here, but I thought that it was a bit too light. Yeah, I thought it was a bit too light, I think. Maybe I could have placed a 60. Maybe I could have placed a double here, but I didn't think it was going to be that significant. Two-hand twirling motion for the bass kicks. Yeah, as you can see, this snare is pretty heavy, whereas this snare is pretty soft. Or just very airy, I guess. I think I use like there's a mini jack here because of the bass kick. I think I use a one-hand gallop here despite both of these sections being bass kicks, just because this is a harder configuration than two-hand twirling, I think. Especially since it'd be pretty ugly because there's a 3/4 snare here as well. So I think the main reason for this is because it's kind of a forced configuration, first off, and secondly, it's just a harder transition than like two-hand twirling. Actually, it might be easier. I don't know. Yeah, it is easier actually, but I think the main reason was just the fact that there's a snare here for 3/4, and there's already enough tension here because of the bass kick here. Same idea, pretty much, like the bass kick roll, two-hand twirling motion, hi-hats create one-hand twirling motion. Most snares will have 1, 2, or 3, 4, with certain exceptions to the rule. There will be some lighter snares that will be layering throughout the chart. You know, general rules that apply throughout the chart. Like the lighter snare rule here, the lighter snare, main snare, lighter snare, easiest configuration because the lighter snare is significant enough. And also the piano and the cute 30 seconds. I have to change that. Let me check this real quick. That's correct. This might be a roll. Maybe I could have used a rolly pattern here actually, I'm not too sure, but yeah, I probably should have used a rolly pattern here. I don't know, let's see what I can do here. I think I could only use like this or something, but it'd be pretty ugly, and the hand bias would pretty much be... Actually, would the hand bias be fine? I don't know, actually. I have to experiment later on. Yeah, basically, it's a fairly different approach because of how differently snares are used in this section, and I felt that the difference in snare usage here is more than sufficient for the chart, so that's what I did. And I didn't really ramp up density, even though some people might have suggested like, you should probably ramp the density of this. And I did ramp it up to some degree by layering some of the lighter snares, but people might argue that it's not enough because the bass kick layering is very, very subtle. And it has been very, very subtle throughout the chart, barring a few 5-note throws or so. But I think it's pretty effective. And it creates some sort of system overall, which I think it was necessary for this type of chart. Excuse me. What the fuck? Okay, that most definitely needed a double there. But yeah, the rest of the section is just a slight repeat of a previous lighter section. Basically, this just a repeat of that section, but let's just go through it anyway because you know, completion is Nism and shit. Again, like the one-hand twirling motion. Maybe I should have used something like no, I don't think I could have done it either way, so whatever. I think I used a slightly different, I think I used a two-hand really motion here because I want to differentiate between this particular rhythm, because this is the same rhythm, essentially. Well, not the same rhythm, but this is basically the same rhythm layering-wise, so I wanted to differentiate by using a one-hand rule here. Bass kicks. Two-hand really motion here. I didn't want to layer 24ths here because I felt it was a bit too crowded going on. It's a little bit too crowded here, so I just kept 2/16. Oh, so I'm still layering the piano, go figure. But I did layer the 24ths here, so I don't know if I want to layer the 24ths here, actually. Actually, this is a bit louder, so that has some sort of reason to it. And I didn't really layer it all that much even. I only layered like 2 additional notes. The main thing that you're hitting is still the bass kick. Because the 24ths are so insignificant because they're just rolls. They're not going to be that significant. Bass kick as usual, snares, yada yada yada. I use a roll here because I didn't think the 24ths were significant enough. Maybe there's a counterexample, but I don't know. Oh, that's a transitional chord. Holes. I believe those are holes. Yeah, those are holes. I think I overlooked. I probably should have changed some of those 2 rolls. I'm gonna change that after the recording. But I'm following the same rules basically throughout the next section. Let me check if this is correct. Is this a fucking... Yeah, this probably should have been a... This should be on 2. Maybe I wanted to emphasize the piano or something? I'm not entirely sure. But I have to like go through it again later on. And this is where the snares stop being very prominent, so I stopped layering the snares. But all the snares are on the first column or the 4th column throughout. And I try to refrain from using too many one-hand rolls, 2-hand rolls, because the bass kicks aren't there anymore either, so. Hold up. Yeah, actually this would be a good idea. One-hand throw because of the repeated distorted note. Piano ending. PR. Kind of bad PR. I blame my tone deafness. Ending whole because, you know, it's the last note of the song. So I want it to be a little bit, not dramatic, but it's to signify the ending of the song. And that's kind of a common convention among charts. Like, they use a long note at the end of the song to like signify like this is the end. You can like stop playing now. Let me just check that one piano bit, which I overlooked. how did I actually, like, wow, I'm retarded. Okay, whatever, I'll find it later. Because, okay, there it is actually. Oh, I think I wanted to like use this because I think it would have been too biased otherwise, because like I would have be biased towards the right hand for so long. I don't know though. Like it's a difference. It's like a conflict between ergonomics and musical relevance at that point, and you know it's just a very minor thing anyway, because like 4 of those notes are part of like a 2-hand really motion anyway. So I really don't know if that's something that I'm gonna change. But yeah, that's pretty much all of Over the Flood. Very simple rules, very modular rules, very specific rules for snares, very specific rules for certain bass kicks, certain hi-hats, and I pretty much follow the rules throughout the entire chart when they're introduced. Like for example, the piano. For certain notes of the piano, like certain chords of the piano, I use offset 190 seconds. And for even louder piano chords, I used doubles for some of them. I even use mini holes for some of them. And I use, for bass kicks, I either create some sort of mini jack if the interval between them is like an 1/8, and if the interval for them is like a 1/16, then I used 2-hand really motion. In general, it doesn't have to be on the same. Doesn't really have to be on like 2 or 3 or 4. It just has to create a 2-hand really motion. I could like tighten that rule, but I think that would have been too limiting overall. And the hi-hat rule, there are some limitations, of course, because you can't really create 1-hand twirling motion forever. So that's something that has its own limitations. But I felt that that was like the best way of differentiating between certain sounds from another, despite both of them being layered at 1/16. There are some inconsistencies overall, but I'm not too sure if it's really worth changing them, because even though that they're not like strictly hi-hats or strictly bass kicks, since they're not strictly bass kicks or hi-hats, I didn't really felt the compulsion to really set a very strict rule for these. Like they could really be anywhere they want. But I don't know really. Like this, for example. This actually is hi-hats. But like there's a bass kick here, so this is fine. But like there are some patterns like this that go to different like, that goes like some weird sound. I don't really know what it's called, but like it's basically some panning hi-hat or something. But yeah, but for the most part, I just use the same rules over and over. And the chart does look like it's the same over and over, but like because of how players process patterns in general, they don't really tell that they're the same thing over and over. Especially when you're playing on like a high rate. Like you can tell like they're of very similar nature. And that's a good thing because it makes it very predictable for the player. But and it's a good type of prediction because the prediction kind of goes well with the song. So it's not that bad, even if I copy pasted it completely, in my opinion anyway. Like as you can see, like even if you just play it on a really quick motion, you can definitely tell like what some of the one-hand throws are going to, like for example the bass kicks. So yeah, I mean, there's not really much else to talk about in the chart. So what are my closing thoughts on the chart? Over the Flood is a very, very simple chart, I feel. Like the layering approach is very, very simple, and there's very, very simple accentuation in the chart. So the chart isn't really all that special when you look at the grand scheme of things, but I'm pretty attached to it because of how well the rules that I've that I've applied seem to fit in very well throughout the chart. And maybe it's because of the fact that like the amen breaks are pretty much the same throughout the entire chart. And Ghost Ship uses very few snares, very few types of snares in the chart. So I could very easily apply this modular rule set to the chart. And it works out very, very well. And even then, there are some situational rules that I brought up, like for example, the snare rule. Like for example, if this is a 1-2 or 3-4, and there's a 16, then this must be a different chord. These are situational rules that I apply, and I follow them fairly strictly. Like, the main thing that I'm attached to the most is how well the rules actually apply to the chart. How well the chart actually flourishes despite having these fairly stringent rules. And it's very easy to tell what all of these notes are going to, like what all of the notes are going to, and like what they're for. Like how's it, like why is this a roll? Why is this like a two-hand throw? Why is there a mini jack? These are all things I can very easily follow, and that's like the main reason why I like the chart so much. I consider this chart to be like in my top 10 charts, maybe top 8, but I wouldn't really, but because of how differently I look at the chart, because I'm very happy with the chart because of how well the chart follows its own rules, and how well and how dynamic the chart is, admittedly, in some sections, despite the amen breaks pretty much repeating over and over. I'm fairly happy with it because of how nicely it follows its own rules, and how well the rules apply to the chart. So, I mean, that's about it. There's not really much I want to talk about. This is just my chart analysis of Over the Flood. As you can see, the layering rules here are very, very straightforward. The patterning rules here are very, very straightforward. But it works out perfectly fine. And to me, that kind of shows that you don't really have to create dumb charts you don't really have to use like very freeform rules to make a really interesting chart. Because you can use very simple rules like I did here, and you can make a chart that's super interesting and super dynamic, even with a song as repetitive as Over the Flood. So, try out layering through fundamentals. Like try to make charts with very simple rules. You don't have to try to not make rules that breaks. Try to not have so many situational rules that break away from the chart. You can just use the same rules over and over, and can use even stricter rules, like for example the snare thing that I brought up, because it makes charts fairly interesting. And I think the consistency is a major, and like a strong sense of consistency overall gives your chart a very strong sense of structure overall. And that's what the chart has. I think the chart has a fairly strong structure overall. Like the main things that can be improved would be the fact that like there are some notes that I felt were missing, and there are some sounds that I forgot, or I'm uncertain as to how I'm supposed to allocate them. But other than that, I felt that the chart is fairly solid. Like the concepts are very prominent, and they're executed mostly well. There might be a couple of missing notes. And yeah, I just have like the only other problem that I can think of is probably like this section here, because I'm dumb and I might have forgotten, or not forgotten, but I might have misheard the snares, because some of these snares are very similar to the snares that go to 1, 2, or 3, 4. But other than that, yeah, I thought the chart was good. I'm pretty happy with it. And I'm usually not too happy about my charts. I actually made a chart I made a chart like last week, and I wasn't too happy with it because of how many additional rules, not additional rules, but how many rules I had to break, or situation rules to make the chart more interesting. But I think it's mostly because the song kind of sucks. But oh well, I guess. But yeah. Very rare. Anyway, yeah, I'm done. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys actually learned something from it. Because I don't know. This song is like Over the Flood is a fairly simply structured chart, and I feel that a lot of people can very easily understand what's going on in the chart. So, yeah. Hopefully, you guys can learn something from it. Like, you can look at charts in a very systematic way. You don't really have to rely on intuition all the time. You don't really have to use very stellar, very unique concepts to make the chart interesting. You can follow very simple rules, very stringent rules to make the chart interesting, and that's what I did there. So, try it out yourself. Try to have stringent rules on what you can do and adhere to them to the best of your ability and see what happens. If your chart is kind of boring, you might need to loosen up with some of the rules. If the chart is too dynamic overall and you end up relying on intuition too much, then try to make the rules stricter or something like that. So yeah, I'm done, and hopefully you guys learned something from it, as I mentioned before. Anyway, peace out, I guess.